You know, Nathaniel Brooks said in smooth, flowing Arabic, his lips curling into a half-smile as he leaned back in his leather chair. Some people are only meant to carry plates, not conversations. The table erupted in soft, restrained laughter, the kind reserved for people who believe themselves too refined to be cruel, yet indulged in it anyway. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow of chandelier light above, reflecting fractured gold across polished marble floors, while outside the tall windows, Manhattan pulsed with quiet, distant energy. Zoe Carter stood just a few feet away, a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as if the words had passed through her like air. She stepped forward, placing a perfectly arranged dish in front of one of the guests, the faint clink of porcelain against glass echoing louder than it should have in the suddenly charged silence. Nathaniel didn't look at her directly. He didn't need to. In his world, people like her existed in the background, moving pieces in a carefully curated life where everything, and everyone, had a place. Careful, he added in Arabic again, his tone softer now, almost amused. We wouldn't want her to spill anything. That might be the most exciting thing she's done all day. Another ripple of laughter, sharper this time. Zoe's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, just for a second, a subtle shift that no one at the table noticed, or cared to notice. The restaurant hummed with low conversation, the distant hum of a jazz piano drifting through the air like a memory, but around Nathaniel's table, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't loud, not overtly cruel, but there was something heavier now, something that lingered just beneath the surface. Zoe turned to leave, her steps measured, controlled, each movement precise as if she were walking a line only she could see. Behind her, Nathaniel continued, his voice dipping into another quiet remark in Arabic, something about appearances, about assumptions, about how easy it was to read people when they never expected to be understood. His friends nodded, some pretending to follow, others simply enjoying the rhythm of his confidence. But then, just as Zoe reached the edge of the table, she stopped. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no sharp intake of breath. Just a pause. The kind that feels small until it changes everything. She turned back slowly, the soft light catching the edges of her face, her eyes steady, calm, almost impossibly composed. And then she spoke. In Arabic. Fluent. Clear. Every syllable precise, her voice neither raised nor trembling, but anchored, deliberate, carrying a weight that cut clean through the room. A person's worth, she said, meeting Nathaniel's gaze for the first time, is never revealed by the language they speak, only by the way they choose to use it. The words didn't echo, but they might as well have. The laughter died instantly, replaced by something else, something quieter, heavier, undeniable. Nathaniel froze. Not dramatically, not like a man caught in a scandal, but like someone whose world had just shifted by an inch, and somehow that inch changed everything. His smile faltered, just enough to be seen, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of his glass as if he had forgotten what to do next. Around him, his friends shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, uncertain now, the easy confidence gone, replaced by an awkward awareness they hadn't signed up for. Zoe didn't move closer. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, her presence filling the space in a way it hadn't before, not because she had raised her voice, but because she hadn't. The jazz music continued somewhere in the background, soft and distant, but at that table, it felt like the entire room had gone still, like even the air was waiting. Nathaniel finally looked at her, really looked this time, and for the first time that night, he wasn't the one in control of the conversation. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a place where conversations usually overlap like soft waves, that silence felt unnatural, almost intrusive, as if something invisible had entered the room and demanded attention. Nathaniel Brooks slowly set his glass down, the faint click against the table louder than intended, his eyes still fixed on Zoe as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that refused to cooperate. That is, he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the effortless arrogance it carried just moments ago. Unexpected. A few of his friends shifted in their chairs, one of them letting out an awkward chuckle that faded too quickly to matter, another reaching for a napkin just to have something to do with their hands. The confidence that had filled the table earlier had dissolved, leaving behind something fragile, uncertain. Zoe did not smile. She did not apologize. She simply adjusted her grip on the tray and met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, grounded, as if she had already moved past the moment, while everyone else was still catching up. "Languages are not rare," she said evenly, her voice soft but steady enough to carry. "But respect should be." The sentence landed with a quiet weight, not sharp, not loud, but undeniable. Nathaniel blinked once, then again, as if recalibrating, his posture shifting forward slightly, elbows brushing the edge of the table. For the first time that evening, he looked around, not at his surroundings, but at the reactions of the people he had been entertaining. Their faces had changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by something closer to discomfort, and perhaps, though no one would say it aloud, a trace of embarrassment. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the atmosphere. "Well," he said, forcing a lightness that did not quite return, "it seems we underestimated you." Zoe tilted her head just slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if the statement itself was incomplete. "It happens," she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a simple truth stated plainly. One of the guests, a woman in a tailored cream blazer, leaned forward with a curious expression. "Where did you learn Arabic?" she asked, her voice careful, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory. Zoe paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the weight of giving it. "My mother taught me," she said. She believed that understanding people mattered more than impressing them. The words settled into the space between them, quieter than before, but somehow heavier. Nathaniel's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, his gaze narrowing slightly, not with judgment, but with something closer to reflection. "And yet," he said, choosing his words more carefully now, "you are here." It was not quite a question, but it carried one. Zoe nodded once, her grip on the tray relaxing just enough to signal that she was no longer bracing against anything. "Yes," she said simply. She did not elaborate, did not offer a story or an explanation to make anyone more comfortable. The simplicity of her answer did more than any long explanation could have. It left no room for assumptions, no space for easy conclusions. Around the table, the energy shifted again, softer now, less performative. The jazz piano in the background seemed louder, or perhaps it was just that no one was trying to talk over it anymore. Nathaniel leaned back slowly, his earlier posture gone, replaced by something more measured, more aware. He studied her for a moment, not as a passing presence, but as a person he had misread entirely. "Miss Carter," he said, the name deliberate, respectful in a way it had not been before. "I owe you an apology." The words were not dramatic, not grand, but they carried a sincerity that surprised even him. Zoe held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. "Not to me," she said quietly. Nathaniel frowned slightly, caught off guard once more. "Then to who?" he asked. Zoe shifted the tray to her other hand, her movements still precise, still controlled. "To the version of yourself you thought was impressive," she said, her voice steady, "because that is the one that just disappeared." And just like that, the silence returned, deeper this time, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if something had been removed from the room, leaving behind a space no one quite knew how to fill. The air did not move, but something inside the room had shifted so deeply that even the smallest sound seemed to carry meaning, and Nathaniel Brooks felt it in a way he could not immediately explain, like a quiet pressure behind his ribs that refused to settle. He leaned back in his chair again, slower this time, his usual ease replaced by careful awareness of every movement, every glance around the table, as if he were seeing the room for the first time rather than controlling it. One of his friends cleared his throat and reached for his glass, but even that small gesture felt out of place now, like a performance that no longer had an audience willing to applaud. Zoe Carter remained where she stood, not frozen, not waiting, simply present, her posture steady, her eyes no longer fixed on Nathaniel but gently scanning the table as if making sure everything was still in order, as if the moment that had just unfolded was only one small part of a much larger rhythm she had already mastered. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and for the first time that evening, he allowed himself to feel something unfamiliar, not embarrassment exactly, not even guilt, but something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and stays longer than expected. "You said your mother taught you," he said, his voice lower now, no longer projecting, no longer trying to impress anyone at the table, but directed only toward her. Zoe nodded once, her expression unchanged, calm but not distant. "She did," she replied. Nathaniel studied her face, searching for something he could define, something that would allow him to place her back into a category he understood, but the effort failed before it fully formed. "Was she a teacher?" he asked, the question coming out more tentative than he intended. Zoe adjusted the edge of the tablecloth slightly, smoothing a crease that no one else would have noticed, her movements precise, almost meditative. "In a way," she said. "She believed every conversation was a lesson, whether people realized it or not." The answer lingered, simple but layered, and Nathaniel felt the weight of it settle into his thoughts, rearranging something he had not questioned in years. Across the table, the woman in the cream blazer glanced at him briefly, then back at Zoe, her earlier curiosity now softened into something closer to respect. Another guest shifted in his seat, his earlier amusement replaced by a quiet attentiveness, as if he were listening more carefully than before, not to respond, but to understand. Nathaniel tapped his fingers once against the table again, then stopped himself, noticing the habit for the first time, and let his hand rest still. "You speak like someone who has had different opportunities," he said, choosing the words slowly, aware now of how easily words could reveal more than intended. Zoe's eyes met his again, steady, unflinching, but not confrontational. "Opportunities do not always stay," she said. "But what they teach you does." The statement did not accuse, did not explain, but it opened a door just enough to suggest there was more behind it, a story that did not need to be told to be understood. Nathaniel felt that same quiet pressure again, stronger now, not uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore, and he realized that for all the control he had built in his life, for all the rooms he had walked into expecting to shape them to his will, this moment was different because it was not his to control. It belonged to her, not because she demanded it, but because she did not. He glanced down at the table, at the arrangement of glasses and silverware, at the details he had always associated with order and success, and for the first time, they seemed smaller, less defining, like props in a scene that had shifted focus without his permission. "I have spent years learning how to read people," he said quietly, almost to himself, though his eyes lifted back to hers as he spoke. "And somehow, I misread you completely." Zoe's expression softened, not into a smile, but into something more human, more understanding, as if she had heard that realization before, not from him, but from others who had stood in the same place without realizing it. "Most people do," she said gently. "Because they are not really looking. They are deciding." The words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a mirror, and Nathaniel felt something inside him shift again, this time more clearly, more undeniably, like a line he had not seen before suddenly becoming visible. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, the piano still playing, the low conversations returning in distant corners, but at that table, something had changed in a way that would not easily return to what it was, and Nathaniel knew, without fully understanding how, that the version of himself who had walked into that room earlier would not be the same one who left it. The moment did not break all at once, but slowly, like glass under pressure that does not shatter yet cannot return to what it was, and Nathaniel Brooks felt it in the way his own thoughts no longer lined up as neatly as they had before. He shifted in his chair again, but this time the movement carried no performance, no intention to reclaim the space, only an attempt to settle into something unfamiliar, something quieter. Around him, His guests had begun to retreat into themselves, their earlier energy replaced by careful glances and restrained gestures, as though each of them had become suddenly aware of how easily a room could change without warning. The woman in the cream blazer folded her hands together on the table, her posture composed, but her eyes remained on Zoe, no longer curious in the casual sense, but attentive, almost reflective. A man across from Nathaniel adjusted his cufflinks, not because they needed adjusting, but because silence had left him with nothing else to occupy his hands. Zoe Carter, however, did not shift to fill the space or to escape it. She stood exactly as she had before, grounded, steady, her presence no longer blending into the background but defining the atmosphere itself in a way that required no effort. Nathaniel watched her for a moment longer, then exhaled through his nose, the sound soft but deliberate. "Tell me something," he said, his voice even, stripped of the earlier sharpness. "If you knew what I was saying from the beginning, why did you not respond right away?" The question hung in the air, not accusatory, but searching, as though he were trying to understand not just her, but the moment that had unfolded around him. Zoe tilted her head slightly, considering him, not the question alone, but the intention behind it. "Because not every moment needs to be interrupted," she said calmly. "Sometimes people reveal more when they believe they are not being heard." The answer landed with a quiet precision that made one of the guests inhale sharply before catching himself. Nathaniel's lips pressed together for a brief second, not in frustration, but in recognition of the truth he could not easily dismiss. He leaned forward again, this time not to dominate the table, but to engage with it, his forearms resting lightly against the edge as though grounding himself in something real. "And what did I reveal?" he asked. Zoe's gaze did not waver. "Confidence," she said first, her tone neutral, acknowledging what was visible. Then she added, just as evenly, "and carelessness." The word did not strike like an accusation. It settled instead, heavier, more enduring, because it was not meant to wound, only to reflect. Nathaniel let out a small breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That is a polite way of saying something less flattering," he said. Zoe did not deny it. "Politeness does not change the meaning," she replied. Across the table, someone shifted again, but no one interrupted. The room had become a place where interruption no longer felt appropriate, as though something more important than conversation was taking place. Nathaniel glanced briefly at his guests, then back at Zoe, and for a moment, there was no distance between them, no roles, no assumptions, only two people standing on opposite sides of a realization neither could ignore. "You are very deliberate with your words," he said. Zoe gave a small nod. "So are you," she replied, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something softer in her tone, not approval, but acknowledgement. Nathaniel leaned back again, slower than before, his eyes drifting for a moment to the tall windows where the city lights flickered like distant signals. He had built a life on precision, on strategy, on understanding leverage and timing, but this was different. This was not a negotiation, not a transaction, not something that could be adjusted or corrected with the right move. This was something that required him to sit with what had already happened. "I have spent a long time believing that I understood how people see me," he said quietly, more to the space than to anyone in particular. Zoe listened without interrupting, her stillness more attentive than any spoken response. "Tonight," he continued, "I realize I have been choosing how I am seen, rather than understanding how I actually appear." The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, and he felt it settle into him as he spoke it aloud. Zoe shifted the tray slightly, the movement small but grounding, as if reminding both of them that the moment, however significant, still existed within a larger world that continued to move. "There is a difference," she said, "between being impressive and being respected." Nathaniel's gaze returned to her immediately, sharper now, not defensive, but focused. "And which one am I?" he asked. Zoe held his eyes for a second longer than before, measuring not the question, but his readiness to hear the answer. Then she spoke, her voice steady, unhurried, and unmistakably clear. "That depends on what you choose next." The words did not conclude the moment. They opened it, extending it forward into something unfinished, something that required action rather than reaction. Around them, the quiet hum of the restaurant resumed its presence, but at that table, time felt slightly altered, as if the next decision carried more weight than any that had come before. Nathaniel did not respond immediately. For once, he allowed the silence to remain, not as a void to be filled, but as a space to think, and in that space, something within him continued to shift, not dramatically, not visibly, but deeply enough that it could not be undone. The silence Zoe left behind did not feel empty, it felt deliberate, like a space carefully placed between two sentences that were never meant to be rushed, and Nathaniel Brooks remained seated in that space longer than anyone at the table expected, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of his glass, unmoving, as though even the smallest gesture might break something he had not yet fully understood. The restaurant had resumed its rhythm, waiters moving gracefully between tables, low conversations returning in soft waves, the piano continuing its steady, unbothered melody, but at Nathaniel's table, the energy had shifted into something quieter, more reflective, as if each person present had been forced into a moment they did not plan for and could not easily dismiss. Zoe Carter turned slightly, not abruptly, not as an exit from discomfort, but as a continuation of her work, lifting the tray with practiced ease and stepping away from the table with the same composure she had held from the beginning, her footsteps measured, unhurried, her presence leaving the space but not the impact she had created within it. Nathaniel watched her go, not openly, not with the same careless attention he had given her before, but with a focus that felt new, intentional, as though he were trying to memorize something he had previously overlooked. One of his guests cleared his throat, attempting to restore some version of the evening they had expected. "Well," the man said lightly, though the effort was visible. "That was enlightening." A few polite smiles appeared, but they did not last, fading as quickly as they formed, because the room no longer supported that kind of shallow recovery. Nathaniel did not respond to the comment. Instead, he reached for the check presenter that had been quietly placed near his hand during the exchange, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate, as if even this simple action required thought. He opened it, glanced at the total without really seeing it, then closed it again, his attention drifting back toward the direction Zoe had gone. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm enough to signal that he was no longer asking for agreement or approval, and before anyone at the table could respond, he pushed his chair back and stood. The motion was smooth, controlled, but it carried a different kind of weight now, not the authority he was used to projecting, but a quiet decision that belonged entirely to him. He moved through the restaurant with a measured pace, weaving between tables, past conversations that did not concern him, toward the service corridor. Where Zoe had disappeared, the soft lighting shifting as he stepped out of the main dining area and into a quieter space lined with polished steel and muted sounds. He paused there for a brief second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if recognizing that whatever came next would not be something he could control in the way he once would have tried. Zoe was near the counter, setting down her tray with the same care she had shown throughout the evening, her focus momentarily on the task at hand, her movements efficient, precise, untouched by the tension she had left behind at the table. She noticed him before he spoke, not by sound, but by presence, and when she turned, her expression remained steady, neither surprised nor guarded, simply attentive. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance that he had not considered earlier in the night. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone measured, stripped of any pretense. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Zoe studied him briefly, not to assess his status or his confidence, but to understand his intention, and after a quiet second, she nodded once. "You already are," she replied. The response was simple, but it shifted the dynamic immediately, placing the conversation on equal ground rather than one dictated by position or expectation. Nathaniel accepted it with a small nod of his own, taking in a breath before continuing. "I am not here to recover the moment at the table," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I am not here to make myself feel better about it." Zoe remained still, listening, her attention undivided, her silence inviting honesty rather than performance. "I am here," he continued, "because I realize something I did not expect to realize tonight, and it does not sit well with me to leave it unfinished." Zoe's eyes softened slightly, not with approval, but with recognition of the effort it took to say that without deflection. "Then do not leave it unfinished," she said. Nathaniel let out a small breath, almost a release, as though the permission to continue had lifted something subtle but real. "You asked me to consider what I choose next," he said, his voice steady. "And I do not intend to let that be a passing thought." Zoe held his gaze, her posture unchanged, grounded, present. "Intentions are quiet," she said, "but choices are visible." The words settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a path, and Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding that whatever he said next would not define him nearly as much as what he chose to do after this moment had passed, and for the first time that evening, he was not searching for the right words to maintain control, but for the right direction to follow. The quiet space between them did not feel like a pause anymore, it felt like a turning point, and Nathaniel Brooks stood in it with an awareness that sharpened every word he was about to choose, every movement he allowed himself to make, as though the moment demanded something more than habit, something more than reflex. He glanced briefly toward the dining room behind him, where the evening continued as if nothing had changed, where his table still waited with half-finished conversations and untouched assumptions, and then he looked back at Zoe Carter, grounding himself in the present rather than the expectation he had left behind. "You said choices are visible," he began, his voice steady but lower than before, carrying a weight that was no longer about being heard, but about being understood. "And I agree with you. Words are easy for me. They always have been." Zoe did not interrupt, her posture unchanged, her attention focused in a way that made it clear she was listening not just to what he said, but to how he said it. Nathaniel continued, slower now, deliberate. "So I will not ask for your approval, and I will not try to explain what I should have already known. But I do want to ask something that matters more than that." Zoe's eyes held his, calm, patient, allowing the question to arrive without pressure. "What would respect have looked like," he said, "if I had chosen it from the beginning?" The question settled into the space between them with a quiet clarity that neither rushed nor softened its impact. Zoe considered him for a moment, not searching for an answer, but measuring whether he was ready to hear one that did not serve him. "It would have looked ordinary," she said finally. Nathaniel's brows shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in the effort to understand the simplicity of it. "Ordinary?" he repeated. Zoe nodded. "Yes," she said. "No performance. No audience. No need to prove anything. Just a conversation where you saw me as a person before deciding what I was worth." The words did not accuse, but they removed any distance he might have tried to place between intention and impact. Nathaniel let them settle, feeling the weight of something he had overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it had always been there, too simple to notice. "I see," he said quietly, though it was not a conclusion, only an acknowledgement of how much he had missed. Zoe shifted her weight slightly, not to step away, but to remain balanced, her presence still grounded, still composed. "Most people do not think they are choosing otherwise," she added, her tone even. "They believe respect is something extra. Something earned. Something reserved." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before returning to hers. "And it is not," he said, more to himself than to her. Zoe did not correct him. She did not need to. The realization was already forming in him, and she allowed it to take shape without interruption. For a moment neither of them spoke, but the silence felt different now, not uncertain, not tense, but reflective, as if the space itself had become part of the conversation rather than a gap between words. Nathaniel shifted his stance slightly, his shoulders relaxing in a way that was subtle but real, as though he had set something down that he had been carrying without noticing. "I cannot change what already happened," he said, his voice steady, grounded. "But I can decide what happens next, not just here, but beyond this room." Zoe's gaze softened slightly again, not in approval, but in recognition that he was no longer speaking to repair a moment, but to redefine a pattern. "Then do not make this about me," she said gently. "If it only matters because I am standing here, it will not last." Nathaniel let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of the truth in her words. "It will not," he agreed. "That is not what I want." He paused for a fraction of a second, not because he lacked words, but because he was choosing them with care he had not shown before. "I want to be the same person when no one is watching," he said. Zoe studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, not skeptical, not convinced, simply present. "That is harder than it sounds," she replied. Nathaniel allowed a faint, genuine smile to appear, the first one that had not been shaped by expectation or control. "I believe you," he said. The moment held, quiet but complete in a way that did not require resolution, and somewhere beyond the service corridor, a bell chimed softly as another order was called, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing without pause, reminding them both that whatever had shifted here would have to exist within a world that did not stop to accommodate it. Nathaniel straightened slightly, not to reassert himself, but to carry the weight of what had just been said with intention rather than habit, and for the first time that evening, his next step did not feel like a reaction, but a choice he was fully aware of making. The space between them lingered for a moment longer, not because either of them needed more time, but because something had already settled into place, something that did not require urgency to be real, and Nathaniel Brooks understood that whatever came next would not be defined by a single conversation, but by whether he carried it beyond this narrow corridor and into the wider world he had spent years shaping without question. He gave a small nod, not as a signal of conclusion, but as acknowledgement, and stepped back just slightly, allowing the distance between them to return in a way that felt respectful rather than dismissive. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, without embellishment, without performance, and for the first time that evening, the words sounded exactly as they were meant to be, simple and complete. Zoe Carter inclined her head just a fraction, receiving the words without attaching more meaning to them than they carried, her composure unchanged, her presence still grounded in the quiet confidence that had defined her from the beginning. "You are welcome," she replied, and then, without hesitation or delay, she turned back toward her work, lifting another tray, adjusting a place setting nearby, continuing with the rhythm of the restaurant as if the moment had already found its place in the past. Nathaniel remained where he was for a brief second longer, watching her move with that same steady precision, and something about it struck him more deeply than anything she had said, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. There was no need for recognition, no need for acknowledgement beyond what had already been exchanged, and that absence of expectation made the moment feel more real than anything he had experienced in a long time. He turned then, walking back toward the dining room, his steps measured, his posture no longer carrying the same quiet assertion of control, but something more balanced, more aware. As he approached his table, the shift in atmosphere became immediately clear. Conversations had resumed, but they were softer now, less certain, as though each person present had adjusted their tone without fully realizing why. His chair remained where he had left it, slightly angled away from the table, a small detail that now felt symbolic in a way he would not have noticed before. He reached it, placed a hand on the back, and paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, before sitting down again. The man who had tried to lighten the mood earlier gave a small, cautious smile. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Nathaniel met his gaze briefly, then looked around the table, taking in each face, each expression, seeing them now not as an audience, but as individuals, each carrying their own assumptions, their own habits, their own unexamined patterns. "Yes," he said simply. "Everything is clearer." The words were not explained further, and no one pressed him to do so. The woman in the cream blazer gave a small nod, as if she understood more than she was willing to articulate, while another guest shifted slightly in his seat, the earlier ease replaced by a quiet attentiveness. A server approached the table, not Zoe, but another member of the staff, offering to refill glasses, to check on the next course, and Nathaniel noticed something he had never consciously observed before: the subtle tension in the way the server stood, the careful politeness, the awareness of position that shaped every movement. He held that awareness for a second longer than usual, then spoke, his tone even, direct, but without the edge it had carried earlier. "Thank you," he said, meeting the server's eyes briefly, acknowledging not just the service, but the person behind it. The server blinked once, surprised, then nodded quickly, continuing with their task, but the moment lingered, small yet distinct. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the table now, no longer tapping, no longer searching for control, and as the evening moved forward, he found himself listening more than speaking, observing more than directing, allowing the space to exist without shaping it to his preference. Outside the tall windows, the city lights continued to glow, steady and distant, unchanged by anything that had occurred inside the restaurant, and yet, for Nathaniel, something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not easily return to what it had been before. He glanced once more toward the direction of the service corridor, not to seek Zoe, not to extend the moment, but to acknowledge it, and then returned his attention to the table, to the people around him, to the choices that would follow, understanding now that clarity was not something he could claim once and forget, but something he would have to choose again, quietly, consistently, long after this night had ended. The evening did not rush forward the way it once would have for Nathaniel Brooks, where time was something to be managed, segmented, and moved through with purpose, but instead unfolded in a slower rhythm, one he had not noticed before because he had never allowed himself to. Conversations at the table continued, but they no longer revolved around him in the same way, and for the first time, he did not attempt to redirect them. He listened, truly listened, to the tone beneath the words, to the pauses people left unspoken, to the subtle ways in which they revealed themselves without realizing it. It was not uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar, like learning to stand still in a room that used to revolve around his movement. Across from him, the man who had once laughed too quickly now spoke more carefully, choosing his words with an awareness that had not been there earlier, while the woman in the cream blazer asked questions that were less about impression and more about understanding, her voice steady, thoughtful. Nathaniel noticed these changes not as isolated moments, but as part of a pattern, one that had likely always been there, hidden beneath the noise of assumption. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down without the habitual tap of his fingers that had once followed, the absence of that small sound marking a change more significant than it appeared. A new course was brought to the table, plated with precision, the server placing each dish with care, and Nathaniel met the server's eyes again, offering a brief nod, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and though the exchange lasted no more than a second, it felt complete in a way that did not require acknowledgement from anyone else. As the meal continued, the conversation shifted toward familiar territory: business, investments, future plans, but Nathaniel found himself approaching it differently, not as a performance of authority, but as a contribution among others, his voice quieter, his words more measured, leaving space rather than filling it. Outside, the city lights reflected against the glass, steady and indifferent, a reminder that the world did not change for moments like this, but that did not make the moment any less real. At one point, his gaze drifted again toward the service corridor, not with the intent to follow, but with an awareness that something important had begun there, something that would not be contained within the walls of this restaurant. Zoe Carter continued her work, moving between tables with the same composed rhythm, her presence consistent, unaffected by the shift she had created, and Nathaniel understood then that the difference between them was not status, or language, or opportunity, but clarity. She had always known where she stood, while he was only beginning to understand where he did. The realization did not come with discomfort this time, but with a quiet steadiness, as if something within him had aligned in a way it had not before. As the evening drew closer to its natural end, the check was brought again, this time by the same server, and Nathaniel accepted it with a calm nod, opening it not as a transaction to be completed, but as one of many small decisions that now carried more meaning than they once had. He placed his card inside, then paused, his hand resting briefly against the leather cover, considering not the amount, but the intention behind the gesture, and when he finally closed it, there was no hesitation, no second thought, only a quiet certainty. Around the table, chairs began to shift, conversations winding down, the subtle signals of departure taking shape, and Nathaniel rose with them, not leading, not directing, simply part of the movement. As they gathered their belongings and stepped toward the exit, he allowed himself one last glance back, not at the table, not at the room, but toward the path that led to where Zoe had stood, acknowledging without words that the most important part of the evening had not been what was planned, but what had interrupted it. When he stepped outside, the night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of the city, and he paused for a moment on the sidewalk, not out of habit, but out of awareness, taking in the world as it was rather than as he expected it to be. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a reminder of schedules, of meetings, of the life that waited beyond this moment, but he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he stood there for a second longer, allowing the stillness to settle, understanding now that clarity was not something that arrived once and stayed, but something that had to be chosen again and again, in ways both small and significant, long after the moment that first revealed it had passed. The city did not slow down for Nathaniel Brooks, and yet, for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to keep pace with it, standing there beneath the soft glow of streetlights as the steady hum of passing cars and distant voices blended into a rhythm he had never truly listened to before. The night air carried a quiet clarity, cool against his skin, grounding him in a way that no boardroom, no deal, no carefully constructed success ever had, and he found himself remaining still for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, as though this pause mattered more than any movement that could follow it. His phone vibrated again in his pocket, more insistent this time, a reminder of the world that expected him to respond, to act, to continue exactly as he always had, but he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he let the moment settle, replaying not the words that had been exchanged, but the feeling beneath them, the quiet shift that had taken place without force, without spectacle, without anything he could measure or control. He had built his life on visibility, on outcomes, on results that could be seen and counted, but what had happened inside that restaurant was none of those things, and yet it carried more weight than most of the decisions he had made in years. After a few seconds, he finally reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone and glancing at the screen, a series of messages waiting, reminders, updates, expectations lined up neatly as they always were, but instead of responding immediately, he locked the screen again and slipped it back into his coat, choosing, for once, not to let urgency dictate his next step. He turned slightly, looking back at the entrance of the restaurant, the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, and for a brief moment, he considered going back inside, not to continue the conversation, not to revisit what had already been said, but simply to acknowledge it again, to make sure it had not been imagined. But he did not move. He understood now that the value of that moment was not in repeating it, but in carrying it forward. Across the street, a man waited at the corner, glancing at the traffic light. A woman adjusted her scarf. Against the breeze, a group of people laughed softly as they passed by, small, ordinary moments unfolding without significance to anyone but those experiencing them, and Nathaniel watched them with a different awareness, noticing how easily he might have overlooked all of it before, how quickly he would have categorized, dismissed, moved on. He began to walk, not toward a destination that demanded urgency, but along the sidewalk with a pace that matched the night itself, steady, unhurried, each step intentional in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. As he moved, his thoughts did not race ahead to the next meeting or the next decision, but stayed with him, grounded in the present, returning again and again to a single realization that had taken shape without announcement, that respect was not something to be granted when convenient, but something to be lived consistently, quietly, without audience. He reached the corner and paused as the light changed, the soft click of the signal marking the transition, and as he stepped forward, he understood that nothing external had changed. His position, his influence, his world remained exactly as it had been, but the way he moved within it would not be the same. Somewhere behind him, inside the restaurant, Zoe Carter continued her work, moving between tables with the same steady presence, unaware of the full extent of what she had set in motion, or perhaps fully aware and simply uninterested in claiming it, and that thought stayed with him as he crossed the street, not as a burden, but as a quiet guide. He did not know when he would see her again, or if he would, and for once, that uncertainty did not feel like something to solve, but something to accept. Because the moment had never been about proximity, or recognition, or continuation, it had been about clarity, and clarity, he realized, did not require repetition to remain real. As he reached the other side of the street, the city stretched out before him, unchanged yet entirely different in the way he now perceived it, and he continued forward, not as the man who had entered the restaurant earlier that evening, but as someone who had finally begun to understand that the most important transformations are the ones no one sees, the ones that do not announce themselves, but reveal their truth in the choices that follow, long after the moment that sparked them has passed.